Hello and welcome to Catamount Community Connection, the public affairs program that airs each and every Sunday here on Catamount Radio. I'm Brian Collamore, your host, and we call the show Catamount Community Connection because we like to speak with community leaders from the business, professional, nonprofit, and political arenas. And the goal of the program is to inform and make our listeners aware of things that are going on in Rutland County and throughout the state. Things that will affect everyone in some cases. We have, I got the tax bill, or at least I got the information on the tax bill today for Rutland Town, and happy to see that we'll pay a little less in property taxes maybe this coming year. I don't know how that is true for how many of the other towns in the county, but we'll find out for sure. Our show is brought to you by the Rutland County Agricultural Society, which has brought you the Vermont State Fair at Rutland since 1846. So we're looking for the 179th fair, and it is coming up very quickly, August 12th through the 16th at the Vermont State Fairgrounds in Rutland. We are very pleased to welcome in today two guests, one of whom has been on the show before, although it's been quite a while. He is Ian Sullivan, the Rutland County State's Attorney, and joining us by telephone from Montpelier is Tim Dumont, who's the Executive Director of the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. So welcome to you both. I'm hoping that you can both hear each other as we go back and forth. Ian doesn't have the benefit of having headphones on, so I will try to turn our microphones off when Tim is speaking, but I thought it would be a great chance for us to get back into discussion about some of the things that did come up this year. I did get a very nice note from Tim with regard to the budgetary support that we were able to offer. The Senate Government Operations Committee sent a letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee asking for their full support for the budgetary needs of the department, and luckily it all came true. I have one bill that I want to talk about, S12, which has to do with the sealing rather than the expungement of criminal records. But I'm wide open, gentlemen, to anything else you want to bring up today. So first of all, Ian, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really always quite excited to talk about the work of the state's attorneys. I know that crime and the orderliness and the peacefulness of our society is near and dear to the heart of many people throughout Rutland. And sometimes our courts can be a bit of a mystery to folks. So I hope that by talking to you, talking to other folks, I'm able to demystify some of what's happening in court so that people can have a better understanding of how their court system is working for them, or not sometimes.
Yeah, it does seem as though, I keep hearing, and I'm sure both you and Tim do too, about the catch and release problem or issue or concern that many people have. We've tried in the legislative sessions to tackle a little bit of that. As I understand it, the issue is hard to resolve totally without a constitutional amendment change, because that has to do with bail and the way and the reasons for which bail can be imposed. And right now, unless I'm not well informed, the only reason a judge has to deny bail is for the defendant to, in all likelihood, not appear again to face charges. So, just to say that he or she is a danger to society is not good enough. That doesn't change the bail conditions. Conditions of release, however, are a different breed of animal, and sometimes we can tweak that a little bit. So hopefully we're on our way, but I know there's more to do.
Yeah, and in 2018, Vermont by statute narrowed how the types of circumstances where bail can be imposed. Bail being an amount of money somebody posts to gain their freedom while awaiting trial. At that point, by Vermont law, a $200 cap was imposed on a number of misdemeanors. It also shifted the analysis that a judge does from will they show up to are they a risk of fleeing, a risk of flight to avoid prosecution. And that's meaningful because we do have folks in and around Rutland who steal from our stores, trespass at stores after getting a notice of trespass, but rarely go more than a few miles. And they sometimes end up with quite a few cases and also don't show up for court. Now, those folks, they're not actively fleeing sometimes, but they are just blowing off their obligation to appear in court. So the risk of flight analysis is more challenging than the will they show up, which is the Vermont and federal constitutional standard. And in not this most recent legislative session, but the one before, the $200 cap was removed in certain circumstances, really to deal with folks who are repeat offenders, who are not abiding by their conditions of release. And because the cap no longer applies, we have seen judges imposing higher bail amounts on those real frequent flyers, because the thinking goes, if you're not going to honor your obligations to show up at court, how can we possibly expect you're ever going to appear, that society is going to get its day in court? That's kind of the thinking that would impose a higher bail on those folks. And that is what we've been seeing. I think there was a recent media piece that the Department of Corrections reports that they're at a 5-year high on their inmate population. Now, got to remember where that 5-year ago mark was. That was smack dab in the very worst of the COVID epidemic, when the Department of Corrections, police, prosecutors, the courts were all trying to minimize how many people were in a congregate living situation, out of a very real concern that people would be dying. So comparing today to 5 years ago in the middle of COVID, I think is a bit of a false equivalence. We should be looking at more normal times before COVID hit.
2019 or so, yeah.
Right.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll
there's
definitely
Tim. Okay.
agree. And I am here, and this is, when you get two folks from Rutland chatting, sometimes us Montpelier folks, we got to butt in. But no, I think the important thing is we've made some really common sense updates to the bail law. We haven't yet tread into the constitutional amendment, but I do think, if we had actually started that constitutional amendment process 4 years ago, when things were starting to percolate on some of these issues, we'd almost be at a point now where we'd be getting that out to the voters. So all this to say, there's no time like the present to have good conversations about how to best move our judicial system forward. And Ian's right that I think that the change that came about, not this past session, but the session before, was striking a balance for people that have repeated instances of failure to appear, really disrupting the court process. And if you go down to see it firsthand at the courthouse there in Rutland, you'll see a very busy place there with the state's attorney and his team and the judicial staff and the defense bar working really hard to move cases. And if someone isn't showing up, it causes a huge amount of cost delay, time delay, not to mention what the victims go through, whether it's retail theft or domestic assault, the whole range. And that is not only difficult for the court, but also it sends a message that the integrity of the process is really getting called into question. So all important pieces, and I do want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the support that we received from Senate Government Operations this year in the appropriations process. I like to think we are, as the Chief Financial and Executive Director of the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, often we're out on the front lines, out in the 14 counties, and it's hard sometimes to tell our story because it is so spread out in the field. But we know that government operations in particular understands that complex government picture that we often try to tell in 30 minutes or less sometimes in testimony in the State House. So we are always on a shoestring budget, and we'll continue to try to be as efficient as possible. But the support that we did receive this year was very helpful.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And again, there were a number of state attorneys that came, I got to get the plural correct, and testified that day. And it was very, very good. I know that each county probably does this court day, or I'm not sure if that's the official name for what happens, but I try to get to that every year. Terry does a great job setting that up here locally, and I'm sure throughout the state. And that's when I get to see a trial that's going on, and sometimes Ian is there, sometimes his assistant is doing that, and then of course the defendants are there, and it's an extremely interesting process for me. And normally a judge will ask legislators during a break, maybe a lunch hour kind of thing, to go into chambers or indeed to go back to the county offices and have lunch together, and that's when we can really unwind and ask them, how are we doing for you? What do you need us to do? What sorts of new statutes or tweaks to an existing statute can we do to make your job a lot easier? I think, unfortunately, a lot of people blame the judiciary, and it's not a fair assignment of blame at all. You hear constantly, well, that judge let that person out again. What the heck is going on? And it isn't anything that they have control over unless the legislature acts and gives them that sort of jurisdiction, I guess, over a particular case. So, yeah.
Right. I sometimes say we've got to wonder, is the system broken or is it working the way it's designed to work? And if the judges are applying the laws as they're passed in, whether you agree with them or not, the system's working as designed.
Yeah, for sure. Tim, it's nice to have you join us. This is so we've got Ian Sullivan in studio, the Rutland County State's Attorney, and then the executive director of the whole group of the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. We don't talk a lot about the sheriffs when we have you guys on, but if Tim has anything there, I happen to know John Campbell pretty well, former senator from Windsor County, and he does a great job. I think he's still with you, correct?
John actually retired, and I assumed his role when he retired. He's if he listens to this, I hope he appreciates the shout out. He's engaged in quite a bit of painting, much like a prior president, and he's quite good at painting. But he's happily retired as of January, and he stepped into his role, and he had originally hired myself to work at the central office to work on legislative matters and policy matters, et cetera, at the State House. So, no, John has moved on to the fine work of fine art. I think he's had some work over at the State House actually. So I'll have to keep you in the loop on that, Mr. Chair. But yeah, with the sheriffs, what's interesting is we're very unique. We're a state department that assists really with the budgeting work and some of the operational work. And then because of what we're doing, we get tied in with a lot of policy and substantive work as well because of our location in Montpelier and being a coordinator. Most other states have like a district attorneys association or sheriff's association. In Vermont, we do not have a state's attorneys association. We do have a sheriff's association, but for the governmental purposes of salaries, benefits, policy work, intergovernmental work, it's really consolidated in our department, and we have two leadership groups. Ian Sullivan actually sits on the executive committee of state's attorneys, and then there's an executive committee of sheriffs. Those two bodies of 5 members each of sheriffs and state's attorneys really oversee our department, almost like a nonprofit board or corporation. And through those leadership groups, we really work a lot of our policy. And that's the group, Mr. Chair, that you saw in your committee, the Executive Committee of State's Attorneys. So with the sheriffs, Sheriff Harlow from Orleans County is the president and chair of the Sheriff's Executive Committee, and up in Orleans County, the only female sheriff in the state, and just a wonderful leader in criminal justice work in the state that we have the pleasure of working with. And with the sheriffs, they have both government work that they do, and then they have other work that they can engage with, and that is not under our jurisdiction as a state department. That's really under their county jurisdiction. The most acute overlay with the sheriffs that we have in oversight is with the transport deputies. These are state employees, 24 of them, 25 of them technically, that we oversee and spread across the state to facilitate the transportation of individuals who are awaiting their day in court, individuals who are presumed innocent, and being detained, usually for serious cases because they've been detained. Just looking at some of our numbers, right, driving both state's attorney work and that transport work of state employees, about 24,000 pending cases as of May 1 statewide, 120 or so pending homicides. So if you think about those numbers that the state's attorney was just mentioning with a 5-year high, we've seen an increase in violent crime, right? We've seen about a 30% increase over the last 3 years of pending homicides. The drug marketplace in Vermont, combined with firearms, combined with a fairly hospitable environment, combined with some staffing shortages for law enforcement, means we're having a really acute uptick in violent crime. And historically, and Ian really can take the mic next from here. It's been tied to domestic violence. Over the last 4, 5, 6 years, that uptick has been driven by the violent overlay between the drug marketplace in Vermont and the prevalence of firearms, both in Vermont and with our adjoining states. And Rutland County has been really one of the counties that has dealt with a lot of this, along with Bennington. Really, it's statewide, but Bennington and Windham have also been hard hit. As a former deputy state's attorney in Washington County, we used to see it here in Washington County as well. But the sheriff's work is very interesting, diverse, but in terms of our real oversight, it's working with those sheriffs on a policy level like we do with the state's attorneys, and then it's a transportation program that we really run out of our central office.
Okay. Before I let Ian go on about the unfortunate connection between the drug trade and the gun trade, if you will, I just had a couple other things. So you're right, and I should have known, Tim, because John Campbell, when I first entered the Senate, was the pro tem of the Senate. He was the senator from Windsor County. And last year, and I'm going to guess it was somewhere around March, maybe April, all of a sudden in the Senate, or not in the Senate, but in the State House cafeteria, were all these pictures that had been taken by John Campbell. And I thought to myself, that can't be the same John Campbell I knew. So I happened to see him in the hallway, and he said, no, yeah, I got into that. And some of his work were just incredible. I mean, he really has a talent for that. So if anybody's looking for a picture for their den or their living room, Google John Campbell, and I'm sure he's got a website, and you can take a look at all of that. The other thing we mentioned really quickly was the constitutional amendment, and just for people's benefit that may be listening and not aware, that is like a 6-year process, right? So it starts in the General Assembly. The Senate has to vote, I believe it's 3/4, it could be 2/3, but I think it's 3/4 in the affirmative for any constitutional change in the first biennium. And if it does, then it goes to the House. They only need a simple majority in the House, and then it stays put for the rest of that biennium. And then the next biennium, so in other words, 3 years later, it just takes a majority of both chambers. And so then it has passed the General Assembly. And again, it sits until there's a general election in the even years. And if the voters of the state of Vermont approve it, and that's why it takes 6 years, then it does become law, and it does change the Constitution. So it isn't anything that you can get done quickly. And right. I think that's really important provision that, it does take some thoughtful work. You can't just change the Constitution in a month. I mean, it involves a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's fast.
Procedural prudence, exactly.
Okay, so I'm sorry. Yeah, we're going back and forth, and it's not your fault. If I gave you these headphones, you could hear when Tim chimed in. But let's go back if we can. And by the way, we're talking to the Rutland County State's Attorney Ian Sullivan and the Executive Director of the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, Tim Leaders Dumont. And Tim had mentioned, for I guess pretty obvious reasons, there is a connection between the drug trade, which has found a home in Vermont, unfortunately. I think Interstate 91 and Interstate 89 are much to blame for that. Those were, roads that didn't exist at one time, and it was a lot harder getting around. But it brought in all those sort of ills from the big cities down south, and then the gun trade. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of both of those, Ian.
Yeah, and it's probably worth putting a fine point on what we are seeing in terms of a change in our homicide trends. Back in December of 2023, statewide, whether it was a charge of murder, manslaughter, or an attempt to commit one of those crimes, we saw 90 pending cases across the state. That was 90 back in December of 2023. Rutland County had 8 of those cases. And fast forward to May of this year, where we see 117 across the state and 14 in Rutland County. That's almost double for us here in Rutland County, and that is a human tragedy that is almost impossible to fully measure, right? Every one of those people, every one of those victims should be at home celebrating the 4th of July, celebrating Thanksgiving, and they'll never get to do that again.
Yeah.
That's a huge hole in their communities, whether they were here for decades or whether they're here just passing through. It is horrific. And that does not capture the unsolved homicides that we unfortunately have far too many of across the state. For those of you who follow the state police on social media, they regularly, on the anniversary of an unsolved homicide, post about it, seeking more information in hopes that maybe we can solve a sometimes decades-old homicide. But talking about the shift in the composition of homicides we're seeing, at least here in Rutland County, it's well known, well documented that historically Vermont has seen about half of its homicides be related to domestic violence. And in the past few years, that hasn't been true here in Rutland County. It's probably not because all of a sudden there's less domestic violence. Instead, it seems to match that uptick in overall homicide filing data we're seeing and match it from the drug trade. You can certainly attribute that to a lot of reasons, right? The drug trade is nothing new, but the willingness to engage in violence to secure even relatively small amounts of money or small amounts of advantage in terms of territory to distribute drugs seems to be far more prevalent than it was even a decade ago. And that's something that I think we should all be really mindful of when we try to lower the amount of accountability, whether that's an adult criminal conviction versus a juvenile youthful offender status, whether it's being able to detain somebody pre-trial because they're from out of state, have no ties to this community, and are just here to further their criminal enterprise. Those are all things that the broader network of people who distribute drugs talk about, right? If you can commit the exact same drug distribution crime here versus New York versus Massachusetts and run very little risk of incarceration in Vermont, that's functionally criminal arbitrage. You'd be crazy to commit those crimes in New York. You should commit them here. And that cannot be an acceptable way for Vermont to go forward. It can't be.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I want to emphasize a little bit. One of the probably most unfair things for the general populace to assume is that when they hear, oh gosh, I got to say this very carefully, when they say a name that seems to not be sort of a familiar name to Vermonters, people begin to sort of assume that it's two drug guys or gals and that it involves only those two people. And, too bad, too sad, but that's the way it goes. But you brought up, Ian, something very important. A lot of times it's a completely innocent victim that had nothing to do with any of it that unfortunately becomes ensnared in this. And you said, won't be able to celebrate the 4th of July or Thanksgiving. And I think all too often we forget about that. And, well, I try not to automatically assume things about, when you read a story in a newspaper, you hear it on the radio or you see it on TV, oh, yeah, it's those drug guys getting together again. And that's probably not fair because it's not 100% true either.
Sure. And even if it is somebody who uses drugs, right? Certainly don't condone that. But I cannot imagine any of us want to have a drug user, somebody who is addicted, be sentenced to death. Right. On the streets, right? That cannot be real justice. Because I think we all know, we've all lived long enough to see people who have gone to a very dark place, but somehow found their way back. And those folks can be deeply valuable and well-loved members of our community, and they should have the chance to come back. It shouldn't be a death sentence.
Yeah, I want to talk about the drug court, too, when we have time and begin to open up to other things. So we're talking with Ian Sullivan, who's our Rutland County State's Attorney, and Tim Leaders Dumont, who's the Executive Director of the whole Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. We're about a third of the way through the show, and we need to take our first break here on Catamount Community Connection, and we will be back with Tim and Ian in just a moment. Welcome back to Catamount Community Connection, our weekly public affairs show here on Catamount Radio. Today we are talking with Ian Sullivan, the Rutland County State's Attorney, and the Executive Director of the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, Tim Leaders Dumont. And so I've jotted down a couple of other things that I was hoping that we could get to in the remaining 35, 40 minutes here. and maybe I'll go to Ian first, and then I want Tim to kind of explain who are these people? Who are these state's attorneys, and what's a deputy state's attorney, and how many people are in the offices, and what sort of caseloads do they handle, all that. But let's talk about treatment court. I think I called it drug court, and maybe it started off by having that moniker, but I think it's now softened a little bit to treatment court. And then I know Ian wanted a little bit of time to talk about stolen guns. So, as I mentioned, and Rutland City Police Chief Brian Kilcullen has been on this show at least 2 or 3 times, along with, and I really like this guy, Emilio Rosario, who's a local police officer on the Rutland City Police Department. And they attend these treatment court graduations, and they show the people that have managed to turn their lives around the full support. Emilio has a great way of putting it. He says, these are people that when I saw them on the street, they used to run away from me, and now they run toward me. And I think that pretty much says everything, but it really is an amazing program and very successful. I know it's not perfect. You have to plead guilty to whatever offense you have, but if you're willing to do it and you get tested very, very stringently, and you stay off the drugs and you get a job and you're back on your feet, it can be a real lifesaver for people.
Yeah, the basic structure is somebody is charged with a crime, they are prepared to plead guilty, and they basically get a contract that says if you successfully complete treatment court, you get a very lenient outcome. If you do not successfully complete treatment court, if you keep heading down the road you've been on, then you will end up with a traditional criminal justice outcome. Typically, that is a jail sentence measured in years. So it's really for folks who are a problem to society, at least the way they were acting before they get into treatment court. And once they're there, they have weekly obligations. Most days of the week, especially early on, they have obligations to engage in treatment, to engage in testing, because the idea is not just, hey, we hope you'll get better. We're actually going to hold you accountable to get better and give you the roadmap to do it. And every 2 weeks, the participants come in front of a judge. Right now it's Judge Griffin. He's doing the treatment courts. He's doing it for the entire state. And they've got to basically own up to the judge on the progress they've made or the backsliding they've engaged in. And if the judge finds that they haven't been holding up their end of the bargain, the judge can impose an immediate sanction. Send them to jail overnight. Send them to jail for a couple of days. That's part of the agreement of being in treatment court. So there is that quick accountability. There's a lot of things that we should all be very proud about with our criminal justice system, the presumption of innocence, trial in front of a jury of your peers, but it doesn't lead to quick accountability. By entering this program, a person is giving up some of those rights so that they can have a chance at this more lenient outcome at the very end of the process if they're successful. And that's all technical, I get that. But the goal is that people achieve a durable and lasting sobriety, that they reintegrate into the community, that they're productive members of society. And hey, I live in this community, right? Like I go food shopping, I go to street festivals, I go to Friday Night Live. And while I've got a job to do, right? I meet a lot of people, I see a lot of people who have made sometimes really bad mistakes, horrible mistakes, unacceptable mistakes, and they rarely look like themselves when they're really in the heart of being addicted to illicit substances. And every now and then you will see somebody who has engaged with treatment court, has really achieved that lasting, durable sobriety, and then you'll see them at a Friday Night Live. And right, there's some color in their skin, there's some meat on their bones, and they're with kids, they're with a partner. Or you'll see them out working at Hannaford's, working on the mountain, whatever it is. They're back in society all the way. They are not living at the edges. They are not preying on society. They are participating and contributing. And in my mind, when we're talking about substance abuse-driven crimes, that is a deeply meaningful public safety outcome that we should all be proud of.
I happened to have the opportunity to sit on the Judicial Retention Committee. I was on judicial nominating for 3 terms, and now I'm on the retention. You term out after a certain amount of time. And Judge Griffin was up this year for retention and mentioned the treatment court. and was very passionate about it, very emotional, as a matter of fact, in his clear support. John Valenti was the guy that began here in Rutland, I think. Well, maybe not began, but when I became aware of the treatment court, John was administering it here in Rutland. And again, just like I mentioned with Officer Rosario, you would be hard-pressed to find a better personality than John Valenti to do that kind of work. So I was very happy to see that Judge Griffin did get retained. In fact, everybody did that was up. And so, yeah, that's part of, it's part of a plan that can rescue people on their way to, as you put it, some darkness in their lives. And it's always good to see it. And I go as often as I can. It's uplifting. It really is.
And I can't tell you how much having an elected like yourself or the mayor or, the appointed folks like the chief of police show up, because for a lot of these people, they burned bridges, right? Their family might not want to talk to them because they've burglarized grandma's house. They've stolen from family members. And just to kind of draw a line, people have cut them off. And it can, for a lot of people, feel like they're no good anymore.
Yeah.
And to have people in positions of authority cheering for their success, supporting them, holding them accountable, of course, but cheering for their success, that can really motivate people in a way that it's hard to replicate. And so for the chief to take an hour or two out of his day is actually, I believe, deeply meaningful.
Yeah, and he assigns people to go.
Yes.
If he can't. All right, let me turn it back to Tim for a second. Tell us about how this is structured, Tim, statewide, the state's attorney's offices. I know there's 14 of them because there's one in each county. How many are staffed in each, and who are likely to be state's attorneys, if there is such a thing?
Well, the one thing I just wanted to tail off is in observing the drug treatment court in the federal system as a judicial extern there in Rutland, I saw one just in particularly inspiring story of someone that had engaged in very, very serious conduct, ended up being a coach in the community, a treatment coach, and then attended future graduations from other people that had survived, obtained a level of sobriety, as Ian said. And then she was the example of success and then was getting paid to work with people that were in need. And it was super inspiring. Anyone that has the opportunity to just learn more about that program, it's life-saving. And people do, and I've seen this in Washington County, people do sometimes die during the course of the pendency of treatment court, but it also has so many success stories, and even if we're saving one or two lives along the way and obtaining some accountability for victims who know that the person's going through that process, it's a huge success story. And publicly, I am an advocate for expanding to accessible, equitable access for all parts of the state, and I will continue to be an advocate for that. I grew up in Addison County, and we're a little bit of a treatment court desert, despite having one in Rutland and Chittenden for some folks with transportation issues. So thank you for the work that's happening in Rutland to both of you on that. In terms of the department's work, the average, state's attorney has often been a deputy state's attorney, so a deputy serving below the state's attorney. Sometimes they've come from the defense bar or private practice prior to, but often it's a deputy state's attorney who has served in that office or in another office who comes in, and really just public servants, government-oriented people who are committed to justice, victim-oriented and disposition or outcome-oriented legal work. And it really is incredible to see our whole team of 14 state's attorneys in the 14 counties representing the people. So one point of clarification that we often get is we don't represent individual victims and we don't have clients. We represent the state or the people or the community. And that's an interesting position to be in. If you're in, State's Attorney Sullivan's position, you're in there advocating for a community, for the state or for the people. And that's really kind of a wonderful place to be in. But it can be difficult at times when people have that confusion of who do we represent. But The offices that are larger, and I say that word relatively because I see some of our sister states having very large county prosecution teams. But in a county like Chittenden County, they have a large number of deputies working there at any given time with support from administrative and secretarial staff. In Washington County, where I worked, we had at any time 3 to 5 deputies working what I would call line prosecution, sometimes gaining some specialization, sometimes doing more general work. And then our smaller counties, Orange County as an example, 1 state's attorney, 1 deputy state's attorney, 1 victim advocate, 1 administrative professional, and 1 secretary. And so you do the whole gamut, even though the volume is slightly lower. So it's a great variation, depends on the county. Essex County and Grand Isle County are 2 part-time state's attorneys. So they have smaller volume in terms of population and therefore smaller court interaction. Still, nonetheless, serious cases come through those offices, but with part-time staff for the most part, people doing work in those offices. Those state attorneys are part-time folks. The rest of the other 12 are full-time state's attorneys with staff 5 days a week doing work in their respective counties. And the offices are comprised in total, all 14 offices, 72 attorneys work in our department roughly, and 58 deputy state's attorneys. So that group carries a lot of cases. Like I said, about 23,000 pending as of May 1. The top 20 prosecutors in our department carried an average of 460 pending cases each. That's a huge number and wildly out of whack from what should be happening in most other states. Collectively, there's 48 prosecutors handling 17,000 cases. These are the top cases, 340 per attorney. Those same 48 are carrying, on average, 104 pending felonies. The national best practices that we've been able to see say you should not be handling more than 100 felonies per year. So when your average is 100, you know you're out of whack with what's happening. And those are all very serious cases. When you look at our victim advocates, these are the folks that work with victims interacting with a pending case. 600 cases per victim advocate. So these are some large numbers reflective of a persistent court backlog that was present before COVID. It did not arise during COVID. It was exacerbated, but it was present before COVID. So our victim advocates, our prosecutorial frontline, and then really the unsung heroes of a lot of the work are paralegals, our legal assistants, our administrative staff and secretaries who are really the front lines working with law enforcement and people calling into our offices. And they process the cases, work with the attorneys and victim advocates, and just some of our longest serving employees are in those positions. And I'll say this for me, they helped me learn how to become a prosecutor because they had seen, 3-4 state's attorneys and countless deputies come through the office in Barrie where I worked. And so both victim advocates and our administrative staff are just the heart and soul of the department that I know Ian and I both deeply appreciate working with. And the chair of our executive committee, Erica Marthage, when I first started the job and I was trying to get a picture of what was happening in some of the counties, she said, "Tim, you have to call the administrative staff and they're going to demystify this process for you." And she was very right. That still rings true today when I am trying to figure out what's going on somewhere. I call the administrative staff and they're just incredible. But it's a huge amount of cases that we're dealing with. As noted, of those 117 pending homicides, we were primarily the staff for 113 of those pending homicides as of May 1. And so that is just an immense amount of serious work. And in some counties in other states, some prosecutors just do misdemeanors or just do this type of case. A lot of the time in Vermont, you're doing a whole array from retail theft to homicide in the course of one day and 1 week. And, something that the state's attorney from Rutland, who's also a data guru who he is really comfortable with statewide data, and he can talk about it. We've seen an increase in trial utilization by our staff, meaning we're moving more cases than we were even a couple of years ago. But because we have persistent, about 6,000 pending felonies, those are going to naturally take priority over your pending misdemeanors. So if you're a storefront in Rutland and you keep having retail theft incidents, but the court docket is, dealing with felonies, it's a hard match. And luckily in Rutland, because of the state's attorney's leadership, there's been a really incredible move to have misdemeanors and felonies have their day in court. Other parts of the state, it's been more persistently felonies on the trial docket, but we're advocating our best to move more misdemeanors because those cases have victims too. Retail theft, misdemeanor domestic assault, which is something people often don't understand. That domestic assault, one way that it gets charged is as a misdemeanor. It can also be charged as a felony. But these are cases that matter, and with our very limited staff, we're pushing that rock up the hill as best we can. And it's an uphill battle, but I think what drives the heart and soul of our department is working with victims and the fulfillment of trying to work towards some semblance of justice and what we're trying to do.
Well, as a person looking in from the outside, I just want to express my appreciation for both the state's attorneys and also the deputy state's attorneys, because it sounds like if I were in that job, there'd be a certain amount of burnout, and there'd be days when I didn't particularly want to go to court. I think that's just human nature. So thank you to everybody in your department, Tim, that gets up every day and seeks justice, and it's got to be frustrating at times for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can think of few things more frustrating than believing deeply in a case, putting it forward as best you can to a jury, and then having to call up a victim and tell them that we weren't able to prove the case. Yeah. That breaks your heart. It absolutely does. But you got to believe in the system and believe that their fight's worth having.
All right, we're going to take our second break. We are speaking today with the Executive Director of the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, Tim Leaders Dumont, and also the Rutland County State's Attorney, Ian Sullivan. And we have a couple other topics. I still want to go back to that S-12 bill. Related to that maybe a little bit was the move to raise the age, which we successfully kind of punted last term or last session on. And when we come back, we'll address those. And Ian wanted still to talk about the unfortunate firearm, the stealing of firearms as well. So let's take a break here on Catamount Community Connection, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Catamount Community Connection. I'm Brian Collamore, your weekly host for the Public Affairs Program, which is brought to you again by the Rutland County Agricultural Society, which has brought you the Vermont State Fair at Rutland since 1846. And fair number 179 is going to be in town August 12th through the 16th. So get your tickets, and you can do that by going online at ParamountVT.org. Let's talk with. Let's go back to Tim here for a second, and tell us about the bill. And I'm pretty sure I voted for this bill, Tim. I'm almost positive I did. S-12, which doesn't expunge records but seals them, right?
Exactly, and you did vote for it, and you've been a supporter of it for a number of years now, I can confirm. But, we've worked with the Department of Public Safety and the Governor's Office for a number of years now with our state's attorneys and really our executive team, which Ian Sullivan sits on there in Rutland. I'm just going to say it, the prior form of expungement that's now been abolished via July 1's enactment of the new sealing bill, Act 60 or S-12, was one of the most extreme forms of deletion of government records in the United States. It was an extreme approach that had harmed victims, defendants, accountability, and placed a huge drain on our frontline staff that was responsible for deleting and at times line item taking a marker and putting, this line here, this word here. Extreme amounts of labor and time were exercised to try to comply with that law. What we've done this year, and it's really been a 5-year effort. So the last half decade, we've been pushing on trying to expand here. We noticed that defendants, people who had either been accused or people who had been convicted of crimes, often wanted access to their records. If they had been through a trial, let's say, and they'd been found not guilty, that record was deleted, even though a jury of their peers had found them not guilty. That is bad government practice, and when someone had to explain to a future employer, I was found not guilty, these things happened at trial, and they went to our office and said, hey, I'd like a copy of my case file, we would say no such record exists, and that was the law. that was extremely bad practice for another reason, being that a future defendant, a future accused person, might have some interaction with someone who had a criminal history. Let's say it's a police officer with a criminal history. And that person in that future case deserves to have access to what we call discovery, Brady-Giglio material. And what we were doing previously was basically knowingly deleting information that could have helped a future accused person. And that is simply bad practice. So we're all of that bad work aside, we've moved to a new system. And what it does is it balances things. It allows for limited use if you have a future criminal justice interaction. Criminal justice purpose is what's said in the statute. And so you can't use it for employment, discrimination, essentially. You can't use it to kick someone off from the employment bench that you have at your office. But you can use it if there's a criminal justice purpose and it's allowed in the statute. If a person has a future, let's say, domestic assault, and they had a prior sealed simple assault on the same victim. That's very relevant. It's directly connected, and it allows for the state to use it for that limited purpose. You still have to give notice to the court. You can't wave it around publicly, but it's that balance between people getting another shot, having that sealed record. Let's say it was a long time ago. But if something comes up again that's relevant either to that case or to a defendant that needs it in a future case, that's where you have to strike that balance. And that gets sorted out in court. And as Ian Sullivan can tell you down there in Rutland, even if it's allowed under the statute, it still will be litigated in the evidentiary rules concerning whether or not it will come in an actual trial. So it's an important move away from deletion. Over the last 5 years, there was something like 75,000 expungement orders where we were deleting records. It was impossible to keep up with, and it was a large scale. If you think about 23,000 pending cases, when we're deleting 70,000 every 5 years, we're deleting entire years' worth of interactions between the public and the government, which, if you think about a law enforcement interaction, that's what it is. The public is interacting with an actor on behalf of the government, and we were deleting many of those interactions. So for people that are interested, if you Google Act 60, there's actually a summary on the legislative website, which is very good and helpful and really talks about some of the changes we've done. There's still some forms of limited expungement. For example, successful completion of post-charge diversion. You're still going to have an expungement there. And deferred sentences. Other than that, we're moving away from deletion of records. And that's incredibly important. Another example of where it comes up, which is very relevant to anyone that watches a pretrial conference or a status conference day in your Rutland courthouse, is when a case is dismissed as a part of a global resolution. Previously, some of those dismissals were resulting in deletion or expungement. Some were resulting in sealing, depending on how were they dismissed. Right now, we've moved to a unified system. So regardless of dismissal type, it will all be sealed. Therefore, it can be in that simplified category, and a future defendant could access their records in the future.
Okay. I know Ian still has the stolen firearms issue. Do you want to tackle that now? Or I just want to quickly mention the raise the age thing, and I don't want to put either you, Tim, or Ian on the spot with this. I am very much in favor of, okay, here's how I see the whole thing, right? If the human brain is not developed by a certain age, and I don't know what age that is, then that should be true for everything. It should be true for voting privileges, for drinking alcohol, for driving, for taking a loan out, for getting married. In other words, if you're an adult and you're viewed that way by society, you should be an adult in all aspects and in all cases. That's just my sort of 25 cents or less explanation of why we have people in Brattleboro as young as 16 years of age that are able to vote in the local municipal elections down there. And yet, if they go to court, they're not going to be held responsible for their actions. I think it was going to move up to 22. I don't remember the exact age, but I think, the governor put it in a bill that we relaxed that. We didn't keep raising it every year. And I don't know what that right age is. you can't rent a car until you're, 25 or 26. So that doesn't make any sense to me either, but I'm sure there's a reason. But that's a private matter with the rental companies and their clients. So again, not putting you on the spot, but that's how if it's going to be true, if there's an age the age of majority, then I think it should be true for everything.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into this.
Okay.
Certainly, there are so many parts of our civic life where people are entitled to rights, right? The right to sit on a jury, right? To be fully engaged, the right to vote. You can sit in judgment of another person, but not be held accountable yourself. That seems backwards to me. And the reality is, I think we all intrinsically know that the expectation of accountability also produces accountability. What I mean by that is when your parents expect you to be awake, ready for breakfast, ready to get on the school bus, ready to go to school, you are far more likely to do that than a set of parents who say, I don't know, maybe next time, maybe tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that, I think, should disturb all of us, that we are making people who have reached the age where they get some of the most cherished rights of citizenship without actually having to be accountable before our laws. That's problematic in my eyes. And what's deeply problematic to me is that these cases, generally speaking, skew towards young men committing acts, right? And when we think about some of the more routine and deeply harmful acts that young men commit, sexual assaults, acts of domestic violence, their victims are predominantly young women. Mm-hmm. And if they are held accountable under Vermont's youthful offender law, those records will be a total mystery to the rest of the world. And one of the ways we see that play out in I think, a deeply harmful way is that a young man will move for youthful offender consideration. The case will disappear from the public eye. And all of a sudden, rumors will fly around our schools that she lied and it all went away. There is no government record that we or that young woman can point to show that, no, it didn't go away. In fact, he was adjudicated to have committed a sexual assault or multiple sexual assaults or multiple acts of domestic violence. That is fostering an environment where boys will be boys and girls live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. That is not equal justice. That is not the rule of law, and it is a system that I hope will go away in future legislative sessions.
Well, you put it a lot more eloquently than I did, but I think we're agreeing there pretty much. So let's talk about, we've got about 6 minutes left here, stolen firearms. And it's, I don't know, it's easy to get a gun if you want, right?
Well, people who are lawfully entitled to hold guns, at least in my estimation, should be able to get one without jumping through undue hoops. Yep. Having said that, I'm well aware that the drug trade loves firearms. They love trading drugs for guns. And once a gun enters into the stream of commerce in the drug market, it rarely does so for a good reason, right? Guns stolen from Vermont end up in Massachusetts, Boston, New York, Connecticut, and are used in acts of violence. We are a supplier of guns and a consumer of drugs. And one of the ways we as a society can respond to that is by changing how we respond to stolen guns. Right now, we functionally have two types of theft: petty larceny and grand larceny. Petty larceny is when you steal something that is $900 or less in value, and grand larceny is $900 or more. And that difference is between a felony and a misdemeanor. Now, I think any person who owns or has purchased guns recently could tell you you can go out and buy a Glock for well less than $900, right? The same types of guns the police use. It is radically different in terms of social harm for a gun to be stolen, put into that black market of drugs for guns, than to steal a Toshiba TV or something like that. So myself, at least a couple of the sheriffs have been vocal that our prohibited person and our stolen property laws should expand to enhance the response when people steal guns or when they knowingly possess stolen guns, so that we can try to intercept how guns are moving through the drug trade and through stolen property trades before they actually get used. Representative Burdett from West Rutland has proposed legislation. I know it's on the wall in House Judiciary. Didn't get a hearing this past session, but I'm very hopeful that in the second part of the biennium, myself, other law enforcement officials will be able to come in, talk about the problems we're seeing, and how a change in legislation can help us intercept guns before they're used in an act of violence.
Okay. Tim, we got about a minute left. If you have any sort of parting words for us, this would be a great time to share them.
Absolutely. You never give an attorney the opportunity for parting words, Mr. Chair. No, I just want to echo Ian's comment that, doing work on the firearm mitigation and safety issues has to be a bipartisan, tripartisan effort. And I think we're seeing that in Vermont, and I'm really encouraged by Representative Burdett's bill is H-19 from last year. And really what it does is the property is a stolen firearm of any value. That should be a grand larceny, and our department's going to stand in favor of moving that bill next year, because having that sit on the misdemeanor docket, as we talked about earlier, it's not going to find its way through the system unless it is something that is more serious, like a felony. One of the things that I'm so proud of doing is we have 28 elected officials in our department, and we try to find the middle of where people are at, that Venn diagram of, let's say, 10 state's attorneys and 10 sheriffs thinking, oh yeah, we agree on this issue. It's amazing how often that can happen. And, maybe even occasionally all 28 agree on something. Often there's nuances, but I think one of the things I'm most proud of is when it comes to the guiding principles of pursuing justice for victims, having a fair process for people who are accused of crimes, safely transporting people to court, having livable working conditions for our frontline staff that's, not overly burdensome. We're all united on all that stuff. And, Rutland counties, both their sheriff and their state's attorney have been great partners to this department. So from up here in the swamp of Montpelier, we appreciate Rutland County's delegation, both legislative and law enforcement.
Well, I don't know that I'd refer to that grand city as a swamp, but I guess
it gets very wet this time of year. Yeah.
Well, listen, Ian, you've got maybe 30 seconds now if you want to kind of have the last word.
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about the future for Rutland County. I've seen so much effort to improve law enforcement and community relations. I see parts of our downtown really growing and being reinvigorated by government and private actions. It is a wonderful time to be living and working in Rutland County.
Yeah, for sure. Next week, by the way, we will be speaking with Eddie Bove, who's on the Rutland City Planning. I think he's the Rutland City Planning Director, and the president of the Board of Aldermen, Dave Allaire, about the TIF districts. That is the economic tool that will allow Rutland to make some very, very expansive development and much needed. So something to look forward to the week after this. But Tim, thank you very much for joining us. And Ian, thank you. I'd love to have you both back on at some point, too.
I'd love it.
Anytime.
Thanks very much, guys. And we will see all of you next week here on Catamount Community Connection.